The courtroom was a cavern of polished wood and whispered tension, its air thick with the weight of 1,000 judgments. Kash Patel stood at the defendant's table, her dark eyes steady but shimmering with something unspoken, like a storm held back by sheer will. She was no stranger to scrutiny. Years as a nurse in underserved communities had hardened her to skepticism, to the raised eyebrows of those who doubted her motives. But this was different. This was a federal courtroom, and the gavel in Judge Eleanor Hart's hand was poised to deliver a verdict that could shatter her life. The charge, misappropriation of charitable funds. The penalty, a staggering $500 million fine. The gallery buzzed, reporters scribbling furiously, their pens like vultures circling a wounded dream. Kash, a woman who'd spent her life giving, now faced ruin for an act she swore was rooted in love. It hadn't always been this way. Kash grew up in a small Ohio town, where the winters were brutal and the summers smelled of cornfields and hope. Her mother, a single parent, worked double shifts at a diner, teaching Kash that kindness was currency stronger than money. At 16, Kash started volunteering at a local clinic, bandaging scraped knees and holding hands through fevers. By 30, she'd built Hearts in Hand, a nonprofit that delivered medical supplies to rural hospitals across the Midwest. Her work was a quiet revolution: syringes for insulin, bandages for burns, hope for the hopeless. But revolutions, even quiet ones, draw enemies. A disgruntled former board member, bitter over a disagreement, had accused her of siphoning funds for personal gain. The evidence was flimsy: mismatched receipts, ambiguous bank transfers, but in a world quick to judge, flimsy was enough. Judge Hart, a woman known for her steely resolve, adjusted her glasses and read the verdict. Her voice was a blade, cutting through the room's hum. Kash Patel, this court finds you liable for the misappropriation of charitable funds. You are hereby fined $500 million, payable immediately, with additional penalties for noncompliance. The gallery gasped. Kash's attorney, a wiry man named Tom, gripped her arm, whispering something about an appeal, but Kash didn't hear him. Her ears rang with the number, $500 million. A sum that could bankrupt a small nation, let alone a woman who lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, some pitying, some triumphant. But Kash didn't flinch. She straightened her spine, her nurse's hands steady as they'd been through countless emergencies, and asked to speak. Your Honor, Kash began, her voice soft but clear, like a bell in a storm. May I address the court? Judge Hart hesitated, her lips a thin line. Permitting a statement after sentencing was unusual, but something in Kash's gaze, resolute, yet tender, made her nod. Kash stepped forward, her worn sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble floor. She wasn't a lawyer, wasn't polished, but her words carried the weight of a life spent in service. I've spent 20 years giving everything to people who had nothing, she said. Not for fame, not for money, but because I know what it's like to be invisible. To be sick and scared and alone. Every dollar I've ever touched went to someone who needed it more. If I've made mistakes, they were in trusting too much, in believing people would see the truth. But I don't regret a single bandage, a single syringe, a single moment of hope we gave. The courtroom was silent, the air taut with her sincerity. Reporters stopped writing. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, their earlier certainty wavering. Judge Hart's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened around her gavel. Kash continued, her voice gaining strength. You can fine me $500 million, but you can't take away what we've done. Last week, a little girl in Akron got insulin because of Hearts in Hand. A man in Flint got a wheelchair. A mother in Dayton held her baby's hand during chemo. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. But I'd do it all again. Her eyes swept the room, landing on the judge. I don't have $500 million, Your Honor. I don't even have $500. But I have this. She placed a hand over her heart. And I'll keep giving it, no matter what you take. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of awe and unease. Judge Hart's expression flickered, a crack in her armor. She'd presided over countless cases, fraud, theft, betrayal, but none like this. Kash's words weren't a defense, they were a mirror, reflecting a truth that made the room feel small. The judge cleared her throat, her voice colder than before. Ms. Patel, your passion is noted, but the law is clear. The fine stands. Yet as she spoke, her eyes betrayed her, glistening with something she couldn't name. Kash nodded, accepting the unyielding verdict, and sat down. Tom whispered urgently about appeals, but Kash's gaze was distant, fixed on a memory of a child's smile, a hand squeezing hers in gratitude. The hearing adjourned, and the courtroom emptied, but the story didn't end there. Outside, the steps were a circus of cameras and microphones, reporters shouting questions. Kash slipped through a side door, avoiding the frenzy, but her words had already escaped, carried by a young journalist who'd recorded her statement. By evening, snippets of her speech were trending on X, shared with hashtags like #JusticeForKash and #HeartsInHand. Strangers posted stories of how Kash's nonprofit had saved their lives, a diabetic father, a cancer survivor, a nurse who'd worked alongside her. The internet, often a crucible of outrage, became a canvas of compassion, painted with stories of her selflessness. Meanwhile, Judge Hart returned to her chambers, the weight of the day pressing against her temples. She was 62, a veteran of the bench, known for her unyielding adherence to the law. But tonight, her chambers felt like a cage. She replayed Kash's words in her mind, each one a pebble in a still pond, rippling outward. She thought of her own daughter, estranged for years, who'd once accused her of being more judge than mother. The accusation had stung, but Hart had buried it beneath duty. Now, Kash's raw honesty unearthed it. She opened her laptop, searching for Hearts in Hand. The website was simple, almost amateurish, but the testimonials were a flood of gratitude, families reunited, lives saved, hope restored. Hart's throat tightened. She hadn't cried in years, not since her daughter left, but now, tears spilled onto her desk, blurring the screen. The next morning, a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Kash is our hero," and "Kindness isn't a crime." They weren't protesters, not in the angry sense, they were neighbors, patients, volunteers, drawn together by a shared belief in one woman's goodness. Among them was a girl named Lily, 9 years old, clutching a handmade card. Lily had been the Akron girl Kash mentioned, the one who'd gotten insulin just in time. Her mother, standing beside her, had driven 3 hours to be there. The crowd grew, their voices soft but persistent, singing a hymn of solidarity. Reporters captured it all, and by noon, the story had spread beyond Ohio, touching hearts in New York, Texas, California. Back in her chambers, Judge Hart watched the news feed, her coffee untouched. She'd always believed the law was a shield, protecting society from chaos. But what if it was also a sword, cutting down the very people it should protect? Kash's case wasn't black and white. It was a mosaic of gray, of human error and human grace. Hart thought of her daughter again, of the years lost to pride and principle. She picked up her phone, hesitating, then dialed a number she hadn't called in a decade. "Clara," she said when her daughter answered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry." The conversation was brief, tearful, a first step toward mending what was broken. By afternoon, an anonymous donor, a tech billionaire moved by Kash's story, pledged to cover the fine, contingent on a retrial. The news broke like a sunrise, flooding X with celebration. Kash, unaware of the donor, was at a shelter, serving meals to the homeless, her hands as steady as ever. When Tom called with the news, she laughed softly, disbelieving. "It's not about the money," she said. "It's about the work." But the donor's act was more than a check, it was a spark, igniting a movement. Crowdfunding campaigns sprang up, raising millions for Hearts in Hand. Volunteers flooded Kash's inbox, offering time, skills, love. That evening, Judge Hart made an unprecedented move. She issued a public statement, her voice trembling on national television. "I've spent my life upholding the law," she said, "but today, I saw justice in a woman's heart. I'm requesting a review of Ms. Patel's case, not because the law was wrong, but because humanity demands we look again." The camera caught a tear rolling down her cheek, and the nation paused, moved by a judge who'd found her own humanity in the reflection of another's. Kash, watching from the shelter's tiny TV, felt no triumph, only gratitude. She thought of her mother, who taught her that kindness was a seed, small but mighty, capable of growing through the hardest ground. The fine was still a shadow, the retrial uncertain, but Kash knew one thing: she'd keep planting those seeds, no matter the cost. The crowd outside the shelter grew, their voices a chorus of hope, singing for a woman who'd given everything and asked for nothing, and in that moment, across a divided nation, people felt something rare, reminder that compassion could outshine judgment, that one heart could change 1,000. The story wasn't over, but it was alive, pulsing with the promise of a better tomorrow. The shelter's fluorescent lights flickered, casting a soft glow over the mismatched tables where Kash served soup to a line of weary faces. Outside, the crowd had swelled, their signs bobbing like lanterns in the dusk, their voices weaving a tapestry of support. Kash Patel, the woman who'd faced a $500 million fine with nothing but her heart, was now a symbol, a reluctant hero in a world hungry for hope. Her speech in the courtroom, raw and unpolished, had spread like wildfire across X, shared by strangers who saw in her a reflection of their own quiet struggles. But Kash didn't feel heroic. She felt tired, her hands aching from hours of ladling soup, her mind reeling from the anonymous donor's pledge to cover her fine. "It's not about the money," she'd told Tom, her attorney, over the phone. "It's about the people." And yet, the world was watching, waiting for her next move. In the days that followed, the story took unexpected turns, like a river carving new paths through stone. The donor, revealed to be Elena Voss, a tech billionaire who'd built her fortune on ethical AI, flew to Ohio to meet Kash. Their meeting wasn't in a boardroom but at a rural clinic where Kash was unpacking donated medical supplies. Elena, tall and reserved, watched Kash hand a nebulizer to an elderly man with asthma, her movements precise yet tender. "I read about you," Elena said, her voice low. "I thought you were too good to be true. But you're real." Kash smiled, brushing sweat from her brow. "I'm just a nurse," she said. "I do what I can." Elena shook her head. "No. You do what others won't." That conversation, unscripted and private, sparked a partnership. Elena didn't just fund the fine, she invested in Hearts in Hand, modernizing its operations and amplifying its reach. But she made one condition: Kash had to lead, not just serve. The retrial loomed, a beacon of uncertainty. Judge Eleanor Hart, still shaken by her own tears in chambers, had pushed for the review, a move that stunned the legal world. Hart was no bleeding heart, her reputation was built on precision, not sentiment. Yet Kash's words had cracked something open, a fault line in her carefully constructed world. Hart began digging into the case herself, poring over documents late into the night. She discovered inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence, bank records manipulated, receipts misdated. The accuser, the former board member, had ties to a rival organization with a history of smearing competitors. Hart's findings weren't enough to overturn the verdict yet, but they were enough to fuel her resolve. She met with Kash privately, an unprecedented act for a judge. "I misjudged you," Hart said, her voice tight. "But I won't let the system fail you twice." Kash, ever humble, only nodded. "It's not about me, Your Honor. It's about the people we can still help." The retrial wasn't just a legal battle, it became a cultural moment. Across the USA, communities rallied. In Chicago, a group of nurses organized a Hearts in Hand Day, delivering free health screenings in Kash's name. In Texas, a high school football team raised funds for her nonprofit by donating their game proceeds. In California, a street artist painted a mural of Kash, her hands outstretched, surrounded by faces of those she'd helped. X buzzed with stories: a veteran who'd received prosthetics, a child who'd survived leukemia, a grandmother who'd found dignity in her final days. Each post was a thread in a growing tapestry, weaving Kash's story into the nation's heart. But not everyone was kind. Trolls called her a fraud, skeptics questioned the donor's motives, and the original accuser doubled down, leaking doctored emails to smear her further. Kash saw the hate but didn't waver. "Let them talk," she told her volunteers. "We'll keep working." The emotional climax came on the eve of the retrial, in a small Ohio church packed with supporters. Kash hadn't wanted a rally, but the community insisted. Lily, the 9-year-old girl from Akron, stood at the podium, her handmade card now framed. "Miss Kash saved my life," she said, her voice small but fierce. "She gave me medicine when I was scared. She's my hero." The room erupted in applause, and Kash, seated in the back, covered her face, tears slipping through her fingers. She wasn't crying for herself but for Lily, for the countless others she'd touched, for the realization that her work had rippled far beyond what she'd imagined. Then, an unexpected figure stepped forward, Clara, Judge Hart's estranged daughter. Clara had seen her mother's tearful statement on TV, had heard Kash's story, and had driven cross-country to be there. "My mom's a judge," Clara said, her voice shaking. "But Kash taught her, and me, what justice really means. It's not just laws. It's love." The room fell silent, then surged with emotion, strangers hugging strangers, their shared humanity a living pulse. Kash took the stage, not to speak but to listen, her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't know that across the country, millions were watching a live stream, their hearts swelling with her. The next day, in court, Judge Hart delivered a ruling that stunned the nation. "After review," she said, "the court finds insufficient evidence to uphold the original verdict. The fine is vacated, and Ms. Patel is cleared of all charges." The gallery roared, but Hart wasn't done. "This case has shown me," she continued, her voice breaking, "that justice must serve humanity, not just the law. Ms. Patel, you've reminded us all what that means." She stepped down from the bench, walked to Kash, and embraced her, a gesture that broke every protocol but felt utterly right. The aftermath was a cascade of light. Hearts in Hand grew, with Elena's funding and a flood of new volunteers. Kash trained others to lead, ensuring the work would outlive her. She visited Lily's family, bringing a new card, this one from Kash, promising to always be there. Judge Hart and Clara began rebuilding their relationship, inspired by Kash's example of forgiveness and persistence. The nation, so often divided, found a moment of unity in her story, a reminder that kindness could bridge even the deepest chasms. Posts multiplied, not just with praise but with pledges, people vowing to help their neighbors, to give without expecting return, to be a little more like Kash. Years later, Kash stood in a new clinic, built with donations inspired by her trial. It was small, like her, but mighty, like her heart. She looked out at the crowd, patients, volunteers, even Judge Hart and Clara, who'd become friends. "This isn't my story," Kash said, her voice steady as ever. "It's ours. Every time you help someone, you're writing it too." The crowd cheered, but Kash was already moving, handing a bandage to a child, her hand still steady, her heart still giving, and in that moment, the world felt a little brighter, a little kinder, a little more human. Kash Patel, the nurse who'd faced ruin and risen, had shown that one act of compassion could spark 1,000, that a single heart could change the course of a nation. Her story wasn't just a chapter, it was a call, echoing across borders, whispering to anyone who'd listen, keep giving. Keep loving. Keep going.